Before the flood, something walked beside Adam's children that Scripture barely dares to name. Enoch saw them, wrote of them, warned of them. What if the beings cast beyond Eden were never human at all, and what Enoch revealed about their true origin was meant to stay buried? Genesis tells us that after Eden, cherubim stood guard at the eastern gate, a sword of flame turning every direction, sealing the way back into paradise. But Scripture never tells us what already existed on the other side of that gate. The land beyond Eden was not empty, and it was not silent, waiting for Adam's children to wander into it unaccompanied. Something was already there, and whatever it was, Genesis refuses to name it outright. This is the piece of the story most churches walk past without a second glance. We are taught about Cain and Abel, about the first murder, about sin spreading across the earth like a stain that would not wash out. But almost no one stops to ask a simpler question. When Cain was driven out, further east than even his parents had gone, what exactly was he afraid of? Genesis 4:14 gives us his own words. "It shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me." Findeth me. Not any wild animal, not any man I might provoke. Cain assumes instantly and without explanation that there are others out there capable of recognizing him and ending his life. Who were they, if humanity at that point was supposed to be only a handful of people? The text grows quiet exactly where the mystery begins, and it is precisely this silence that the Book of Enoch claims to break. Enoch, the man Scripture says walked so closely with God that he never tasted death, wrote of beings existing far outside the boundaries of ordinary human experience. He called them watchers, not fallen men, not spirits formed from dust the way Adam was. Heavenly beings, originally appointed to observe creation from a distance, who eventually abandoned their assigned post and crossed into territory they were never meant to enter. Genesis 6 offers only a fragment of what Enoch later expands into a full account. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. 4 lines, buried between genealogies, most readers skip past entirely. And yet inside those 4 lines sits the seed of an entire hidden history. The church eventually stopped teaching. Enoch names 200 of these watchers, led by one called Semjaza, descending onto Mount Hermon, not in secret, not as some unplanned lapse, by oath. They bound themselves together with a vow, fully conscious of what they were about to do, fully aware the boundary they were crossing had never once been crossed by beings of their kind before. This was not the gentle seduction later traditions softened it into for easier sermons. This was something else, choosing with full intention to enter a world that was never built for it. And once they entered, they did not simply blend into the human landscape and disappear. Their offspring towered over the daughters of men who bore them, beings Genesis calls Nephilim, a word that makes nearly every honest translator pause, because its root carries the sense of those who fall, or those who cause others to fall. It is not a flattering word, and it was never meant to be. Jude's brief epistle, easy to read past if you are moving quickly, echoes this same memory generations later, describing angels who kept not their first estate but left their own habitation, now held in chains of darkness reserved for judgment. Peter's second epistle repeats almost the identical claim, as though both writers were drawing water from the same well of knowledge that the wider church eventually decided to seal shut. Consider what this actually means for the world Adam's grandchildren were born into. These were not isolated incidents scattered across centuries. Enoch describes an entire generation growing up under the shadow of beings who were never meant to walk among them, beings whose children grew faster, grew larger, and grew hungrier than anything the earth had produced before. Genesis 6:5 tells us that God saw the wickedness of man was great, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Read that verse next to Enoch's account, and it stops sounding like ordinary human corruption. It starts sounding like a world being reshaped from the outside by something that had no business reshaping it at all. Centuries later, when Moses sends scouts into Canaan, Numbers 13:33 still records the memory of giants in the land, descendants of Anak, said to come from the Nephilim. The bloodline Enoch traces back to Mount Hermon did not vanish quietly. It left footprints history kept stumbling over long after the floodwaters receded, So if the beings already present beyond Eden were never human to begin with, if what moved through the earliest centuries after the garden was something else entirely wearing the shape of presence rather than flesh, then the silence in Genesis stops looking like an absence. It starts looking like a door closed on purpose, and Enoch is the rare ancient voice willing to describe exactly what stood on the other side of it. What he describes is not decoration added for dramatic effect. It is origin, where these beings actually came from, why they were permitted to exist as long as they did before judgment finally came for them, why the flood that followed was never simply a punishment for ordinary human wickedness, but a response to something that had crossed a line no creature, heavenly or otherwise, was ever supposed to cross. Once you read it this way, the opening chapters of Genesis stop functioning as quiet background information and start reading like the first pages of a record someone tried very hard to keep buried. If this is the kind of mystery that pulls at something in you, the kind institutional teaching tends to walk around rather than through, the kind that leaves you wanting real answers instead of comfortable silence, then this channel exists for exactly that hunger in you. Make sure you are subscribed, because everything coming next builds directly on what Enoch reveals about where these beings truly came from, and it goes places most sermons never dare to follow. And if you would rather hold this history in your hands than simply hear it once and let it fade by morning, our premium illustrated biblical mystery guide was built for exactly that. It walks page by page through the Book of Enoch, the Watchers, their true origin, the giants they fathered, and the world that existed before the flood erased nearly every trace of it. It is richly illustrated, carefully detailed, and the kind of guide you will find yourself returning to long after this video has ended. The link is waiting for you in the comment pinned right below this video. To understand what these beings actually were, you have to set aside the picture most of us grew up with. Winged figures strumming harps, vague and harmless, decorative rather than dangerous. Scripture itself never describes angels that way, and the Watchers least of all. Job 1.6 speaks of the sons of God presenting themselves before the throne, a phrase that shows up again in Job 38.7, where these same beings are present at creation itself, shouting for joy while the foundations of the earth were being laid. Psalm 89:7 calls them the assembly of the holy ones, feared, set apart, occupying a tier of existence that has nothing to do with human souls climbing toward heaven after death. These were never people. They were already there before people existed at all. Later interpreters, uncomfortable with what this implied, tried to soften the claim. Some argued that sons of God simply meant the righteous line of Seth, and daughters of men meant the corrupted line of Cain, as if the entire account were really just a story about good families marrying into bad ones. It is a tidy explanation, and it is also one the earliest readers of this text would not have recognized. The phrase sons of God appears nowhere else in the Hebrew scriptures to describe ordinary human men, righteous or otherwise. It consistently describes heavenly beings, the same beings present in Job's throne room and at creation's foundations. Peter, writing centuries after Genesis was first set down, does not describe a marriage dispute between two human bloodlines. He writes of the angels that sinned, cast down and delivered into chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment, and in his first letter speaks of Christ proclaiming victory to the spirits in prison, beings disobedient in the days of Noah. This is not the language of family feuds. It is the language of cosmic rebellion, remembered and judged. Enoch builds directly on this foundation, and he is far more specific than Genesis ever bothers to be. He does not describe a handful of confused spirits wandering off course. He describes structure, order, a chain of command among the Watchers that mirrors, almost mockingly, the order they abandoned. Semjaza stands at the head of 200, and beneath him, Enoch lists names most modern readers have never once heard spoken aloud: Arachiel, Ramiel, Kokabiel, Tamiel, and the one whose name carries the heaviest weight of all, Azazel. Each of these is assigned a leadership role over a group of 10, almost as if the rebellion itself was organized with the same precision the original heavenly order required. This was not chaos breaking loose. It was a structure intact, simply turned against the purpose it was built for. And what this structure produced was not seduction in any romantic sense people like to imagine when they hear angels and women. Enoch is specific about what came next, and it is uncomfortable precisely because it refuses to soften into metaphor. The Watchers did not only take wives. According to Enoch's account, Azazel taught men the making of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, weapons humanity had no need for and no precedent to defend against. Other Watchers taught the cutting of roots, the working of metals into ornament, the painting of faces, the binding of charms, knowledge that on the surface sounds almost trivial until you realize what it actually represents. Power transferred from beings who were never supposed to share it into hands that had no framework yet for using it responsibly. This is the forbidden knowledge tradition keeps circling back to, and Enoch is the only ancient text bold enough to name exactly who handed it over and why it mattered enough for judgment to follow. The offspring of these unions were not simply unusual children. Enoch describes them growing at a pace no human child could match, reaching heights of 300 cubits in some manuscripts, numbers later scribes themselves seemed uneasy with, scaling them down in other versions, because the scale of the claim was almost too much to transcribe without flinching. Whatever the precise number once was, the pattern in the text is consistent across every surviving copy. These were beings whose hunger outpaced what the earth could supply. Enoch records that they consumed the labor of men, and when that was no longer enough, they began consuming men themselves, and then turned on birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish, devouring flesh and drinking blood until the earth itself, in Enoch's language, laid accusation against the lawless ones. This is the detail most retellings leave out, because it complicates the comfortable version of the story. We want the Nephilim to be simply large, simply strange, simply a footnote on the way to the flood. Enoch refuses to let them stay that small. He frames their existence as an active corruption of the created order, not a passive oddity sitting quietly in the background of Genesis. Deuteronomy 3:11 still remembers Og, king of Bashan, of the remnant of giants, whose bed of iron is recorded with a precision that reads less like legend and more like a society still measuring the wreckage left behind. The memory did not fade easily. It left dimensions behind for someone generations later to write down. What makes Enoch's account difficult to dismiss is not its strangeness. Ancient texts are full of strange claims that collapse the moment you look closely. What makes this one different is how carefully it answers questions Genesis raises and then abandons: who these beings were, what their hierarchy looked like, what specifically they taught, and what their children became. Genesis gives you 4 verses. Enoch gives you the architecture behind those 4 verses. And once you see the architecture, the silence in Genesis starts to feel less like brevity and more like restraint, as though the writer knew the fuller account existed somewhere and chose, for reasons we can only guess at, to leave it for someone else to tell. And someone else did tell it. Enoch wrote it down, sealed it as a warning, and the early church read it for centuries before it was quietly set aside, excluded from the canon most of us inherited, without ever being told why. Jude himself, writing well within the boundaries of what later became the New Testament, quotes Enoch directly, naming him by name, treating his prophecy as something worth repeating rather than something to be ashamed of. That alone should give us pause. A book the modern church rarely opens was, at one point, considered reliable enough to be cited as scripture quoting scripture. The question worth sitting with is not whether Enoch's account is comfortable. It clearly is not. The question is whether the discomfort is exactly why it was buried in the first place. Heaven did not stay silent forever. Enoch describes a moment when the cries of men, the suffering caused by giants who had grown too large and too hungry for the world to sustain, finally reached beyond the earth itself. 4 archangels, Michael, Sariel, Raphael, and Gabriel, looked down and saw blood being shed across the whole earth, and all lawlessness being committed upon it. This was not a quiet observation. Enoch describes them bringing the matter directly before God, naming Azazel specifically, naming Semjaza specifically, asking why beings who had abandoned their station should be allowed to continue corrupting what was never theirs to touch. Genesis compresses this entire confrontation into a single devastating sentence. The Lord said, "My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. yet his days shall be 120 years. A countdown begins. Not 120 years of patience extended indefinitely, but a sentence handed down, a window closing. Genesis 6.7 follows shortly after, with God's resolve laid bare. I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air. The wording matters here. Man and beast and creeping thing and fowl. The corruption Enoch describes was never contained to humanity alone. It had spread through the created order itself, which is why the judgment that followed was never going to be partial. But judgment in this account was never aimed only at humanity. Enoch records God dispatching each archangel with a specific task, and the precision of these assignments tells you something the flood story alone never quite communicates. Raphael is sent to bind Azazel hand and foot, casting him into darkness in a place called Dudael, covering him with rough and jagged rocks so that he would see no light and remain there until the great day of judgment still to come. Gabriel is sent against the children of the Watchers themselves, the giants whose violence had grown beyond anything the earth could absorb, setting them against one another in mutual destruction. Michael is sent to Semjaza and the rest, bound for 70 generations beneath the hills of the earth, until the day appointed for their final reckoning. This is not a flood washing away an inconvenience. It is a coordinated dismantling of an entire structure that had been operating against the created order for generations. And in the middle of this dismantling stands one man who had done nothing to deserve being swept up in it. Genesis 6:8 says simply, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." Enoch adds weight to this grace by showing us exactly what Noah was standing apart from. He was not merely a good man in a generally bad era. He was one of the only human beings left whose bloodline had not been touched, whose household had not absorbed whatever the Watchers and their offspring had been spreading across the earth for generations. Some traditions go further still, suggesting Noah's own birth caused alarm among those who first saw him, his appearance unlike anything expected, prompting questions about whether even his lineage had remained untouched. Whether or not every detail of that tradition survived intact, the underlying claim is consistent across multiple ancient sources. By the time the flood came, purity itself had become something worth verifying, something no longer assumed by default. Zariel, the fourth archangel, was given perhaps the most personal assignment of all. He was sent directly to Noah to warn him plainly that the earth was about to be destroyed by a flood and to instruct him in what he needed to do to escape it. This detail rarely makes it into children's retellings of the Ark, yet it reframes the entire narrative. Noah was not simply a man who happened to build a large boat out of caution. He was a man personally contacted, personally warned, brought into the confidence of heaven at the exact moment heaven decided enough was enough. The flood was never random. It was surgical, aimed precisely at undoing what the Watchers had done, while preserving the one bloodline still capable of carrying creation forward afterward. What makes this account difficult to dismiss as later invention is the company it keeps. Fragments of Enoch were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, copied by hand centuries before Christ, proving the text was circulating and considered worth preserving, long before any later editor could be accused of inventing it for dramatic effect. The Book of Jubilees, another text the Qumran community clearly treasured, repeats the same basic framework almost verbatim: Watchers descending, teaching forbidden arts, fathering giants, judgment following. The Genesis Apocryphon, also recovered from the same caves, shows Noah's own father Lamech questioning whether his newborn son was truly his, suspicious that something otherworldly may have touched his household, which only makes sense against the backdrop Enoch has already laid out. These were not isolated storytellers working in competition with one another. They were drawing from a shared memory, old enough that, by the time these scrolls were copied, the events themselves were already ancient history. What happened to the giants themselves during the flood is where the account grows even stranger than most retellings allow. Their physical bodies, Enoch tells us, perished in the waters along with nearly everyone else, but their spirits, born from the unnatural union of heavenly beings and human women, did not simply cease to exist the way an ordinary human soul might be expected to. They had no proper place to go. Not fully angelic, not fully human, They became something the text calls evil spirits, wandering the earth without bodies, without rest, and without the inheritance either heaven or earth was prepared to offer them. This single detail explains something that has puzzled readers of Scripture for centuries: why the language of demons and unclean spirits saturates the New Testament so thoroughly, with so little explanation of where they actually came from. Every time the Gospels describe Christ casting out an unclean spirit, the text assumes the reader already understands what these spirits are and where they originated, as though the explanation were common knowledge that simply never needed restating. Enoch gives us the explanation Genesis never bothered to spell out, and the Gospels never paused to repeat. The flood did not erase the consequences of what the Watchers had done. It only removed the bodies. What remained loose in the world afterward was something the next chapters of this story have not finished accounting for. And Enoch makes it painfully clear that judgment, once handed down, does not always mean the matter is closed. If the flood was meant to end this story, Genesis itself refuses to let it end there. Tucked into the same verse that first introduces the Nephilim is a phrase most readers glide right past without ever stopping to ask what it implies. Genesis 6:4 says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also after that, after the flood, after the waters receded and Noah's family stepped onto dry ground as the only humans left alive." Whatever had produced giants before the judgment found a way to produce them again afterward. And Scripture states this so plainly that it almost dares you to keep reading instead of pausing to wonder how something already drowned could resurface on the other side. This is not a contradiction tucked away by careless editors, easily explained as a scribal slip centuries removed from the original event. It is a thread picked back up generations later, when Moses sends 12 men into Canaan to scout the land God had promised. They return with grapes too heavy for one man to carry, and a report that terrifies the entire camp. Numbers 13:33 records their words directly. "There we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants." The fear in their voices was not exaggeration meant to excuse cowardice. It was recognition. They had heard the old stories, perhaps from their fathers, perhaps from fragments of memory that had survived the flood inside Noah's own household, and now they were standing in a land where those stories had apparently never stopped being true. Deuteronomy fills in even more of the picture than Numbers does. Deuteronomy 2:10 through 2:11 describes the Emim, a people great and many and tall as the Anakims, who were accounted giants the same way the Anakims were. A few verses later, Deuteronomy 2:20 describes the Zamzummim, another giant people the Ammonites displaced, with their own land once called Zamzummim before it had any other name. These are not throwaway details inserted for color. Moses is cataloging an entire network of giant clans spread across the region: Anakim, Emim, Zamzummim, Rephaim, each one distinct, each one apparently large enough and threatening enough that later generations felt compelled to name them individually rather than lump them together as a vague rumor. Og, king of Bashan, anchors this entire pattern in a way that is almost impossible to explain away as folklore. Deuteronomy 3:11 does not speak in the soft language of legend. It gives you a measurement you could verify if his bed had survived. 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth of it, after the cubit of a man. Depending on how you calculate the ancient cubit using the standard measurements scholars typically apply, that bed stretched somewhere between 13 and 20 feet long. The text even tells you where to go check for yourself, noting that the bed remained on display in Rabbath of the children of Ammon long after Og himself was defeated. This is not how you describe a myth. This is how you describe physical evidence that an entire culture had already seen with their own eyes and felt no need to exaggerate further. The Anakim alone deserve a closer look, because Scripture does not leave them as a vague category either. Joshua 15:14 names 3 sons of Anak directly: Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, driven out of Hebron specifically by Caleb, the same Caleb who had stood among the original spies decades earlier and refused to let fear of these very giants stop him from trusting what God had promised. There is something almost poetic in that detail. The man who once looked at the sons of Anak and believed God anyway was the same man permitted a lifetime later to finally drive their descendants out of the land by name. Joshua 11:21 through 11:22 goes further, noting that Joshua cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, leaving none remaining in the land of the children of Israel except a remnant left in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, the very cities generations later that would produce Goliath and his brothers. So how did giants return to the earth after the flood drowned every last one of them, along with everyone else who had not boarded the ark? Enoch and the surrounding tradition never fully resolve this with the same precision they bring to the original fall of the Watchers, and any honest account has to admit that the text grows quieter here than we might wish. What does seem consistent across multiple ancient sources is that the corrupted bloodline did not require a second descent of Watchers to reappear. Some traditions point toward Ham's line, particularly through Canaan, as the channel through which whatever had been mixed into humanity before the flood resurfaced afterward, carried forward in blood, rather than reintroduced from outside. Others point to the wandering spirits Enoch describes, the disembodied remnants of the first giants, finding ways to influence and corrupt a second time what they could no longer physically father themselves. Scripture does not hand us a tidy mechanism, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest to the text. What it hands us instead is a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. By the time David stood against Goliath centuries later, the memory had not faded at all. 2 Samuel 21:19 through 21:22 lists not one but several giants from Gath connected to Goliath's own household, including a brother whose spearhead alone weighed 300 shekels of brass. These were not isolated monsters, appearing at random across scattered centuries. They were a lineage, tracked, named, and eventually confronted one family at a time by the very people God had set apart to stand against everything the Watchers had originally unleashed. David's victory over Goliath, the version every child learns in Sunday school, was never simply a story about courage facing intimidation. It was the latest chapter in a war that had started long before either of them was born, a war Genesis hints at, Enoch explains, and the rest of Scripture quietly continues to fight all the way through to the kings of Israel, standing against the last remnants of a bloodline heaven had already judged once and apparently had to keep judging again. Every shepherd boy who has ever been told to imagine himself as David, standing before Goliath, has, without realizing it, been placed inside a story that reaches back past Bethlehem, past Sinai, past the ark itself, to a garden gate where something not human was already waiting on the other side. If beings who were never human really did walk this earth before the flood, the question that naturally follows is whether they left anything behind besides verses and warnings. Most ancient ruins explain themselves easily enough once you understand the tools and the timeline available to the people who built them. A handful of sites refuse to cooperate with that explanation, no matter how many times researchers try to force them into it, and it is worth asking, plainly and without embarrassment, whether Enoch's account of forbidden knowledge transferred from heaven to earth might be the missing piece those sites have been waiting for. Baalbek in modern Lebanon sits at the top of nearly every list like this for a reason that has nothing to do with sensationalism. Its foundation includes stones so massive that modern engineers, with cranes and hydraulics no ancient civilization possessed, still describe moving them as a serious logistical challenge. One block alone, still resting in a nearby quarry because it was apparently too large even for whoever cut it to finish transporting, weighs close to 1,000 tons. Local tradition recorded by ancient writers, long before modern archaeology arrived on the scene, already associated the site with giants, claiming it had been built before the flood by beings of unusual size and strength. You do not need to accept every detail of that tradition to notice how strange it is that the tradition exists at all, attached specifically to the one site modern engineering still cannot fully explain. Göbekli Tepe complicates the picture from a different angle entirely. Discovered in modern Turkey and dated by archaeologists to roughly 11,000 years ago, it predates Stonehenge by thousands of years and predates the commonly accepted timeline for organized agriculture by a margin researchers are still arguing about. What makes it remarkable is not simply its age, it is the level of organization the site implies. Massive carved pillars, arranged deliberately, depicting animals with a level of artistic skill that conventional timelines insist hunter-gatherer societies should not yet possess. Enoch describes knowledge handed down from beings never meant to share it, working of stone, working of metal, mastery of skills humanity had no organic path toward developing on its own. Göbekli Tepe does not prove Enoch's account. It simply sits there, refusing to fit comfortably into the story we are usually told about how civilization slowly, gradually, predictably came together on its own timeline. Puma Punku, high in the Bolivian Andes, raises the same uncomfortable question from yet another angle. The stones there are not merely large, they are cut with an angular precision that stoneworking experts have struggled for over a century to replicate using tools believed available to the culture credited with building it. Interlocking blocks, drilled holes of consistent diameter, surfaces flat enough to question how they were finished without modern measuring instruments. Conventional explanations exist, and serious researchers have proposed reasonable methods using harder stone tools and immense patience. But the question persists precisely because the precision involved keeps exceeding what patience alone is generally thought capable of producing. Whether or not these particular stones connect directly to anything Enoch describes, they belong to the same broader pattern. This entire video keeps circling back toward structures that seem to remember something about pre-flood capability that history's official timeline does not yet know how to account for. It is worth noticing, too, that Israel was never alone in remembering a flood or in remembering beings who came down from the heavens before it. Mesopotamian texts far older than the version we read in Genesis describe nearly identical events using different names. The Atrahasis epic and the flood account, embedded within the Epic of Gilgamesh, both describe divine beings growing weary of a corrupted humanity, a chosen survivor warned in advance, a vessel built to outlast the coming waters. Sumerian king lists, compiled by scribes with no interest in supporting anyone's theology, describe a series of rulers reigning for implausibly long stretches before the flood, followed immediately by a clear, deliberate break in the record once the waters arrived. These are not Israelite inventions borrowed wholesale from neighboring cultures, nor are they the opposite, an Israelite original copied carelessly by everyone nearby. They read more like independent witnesses to the same underlying memory, each civilization preserving its own fragment of a catastrophe and a corruption too significant for any single culture to have simply imagined into existence on its own. What ties these sites together is not simply mystery for its own sake. It is the specific shape of the mystery. Enoch does not describe primitive humanity slowly inventing tools through trial and error the way conventional history assumes every ancient culture must have done. He describes knowledge transferred suddenly from beings already possessing it into a world that had no developmental path of its own toward acquiring it that quickly. If that transfer really happened the way Enoch claims, then we would expect exactly this kind of archaeological inconsistency scattered across the ancient world. Sites too advanced for their assumed timeline, technical skill that arrives without the centuries of gradual experimentation we would normally expect to precede it. None of this requires abandoning faith in Scripture's reliability. If anything, it strengthens the case that Genesis was never exaggerating when it described a pre-flood world capable of producing both extraordinary wickedness and extraordinary capability simultaneously. Genesis 6:11 to 6:13 tells us the earth was filled with violence and corrupt before God, language strong enough that a civilization capable of building what Baalbek's foundation still demonstrates does not sound like an overstatement anymore. It sounds like exactly the kind of world Enoch already warned us about, a world advanced enough to leave behind stones modern engineers still cannot fully explain, and corrupted enough that heaven eventually decided the only remaining solution was to start again from a single righteous family and a wooden ark. The flood erased almost everything from that world. Bodies, bloodlines, entire cities swallowed by water, until nothing visible remained to argue with. But stone does not drown the way flesh does. Stone, properly cut and properly placed, can survive long enough for someone thousands of years later to stand in front of it and ask the same question Enoch was already answering long before archaeology existed as a discipline. Who actually had the knowledge to build this? And where did that knowledge originally come from? The stones themselves do not answer back. They simply remain patient and silent, waiting for someone willing to take the older texts seriously enough to listen to what they have been claiming all along. What walked beyond Eden's gate was never simply human, and Enoch made certain that truth would outlive every attempt to bury it. Thank you for spending this time uncovering what most teaching leaves in silence. If this stirred something in you, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell me in the comments which part struck you hardest. More of this history is waiting on your screen right now. And if you want the deeper version of everything Enoch revealed, our premium illustrated biblical mystery guide is sitting in the pinned comment below, illustrated and ready to walk you through the Watchers, the Giants, and the world before the flood, page by page.